I was going to talk about climate change in the Arctic, and then my focus is terrestrial ecosystem change. I'm obviously at Grand Valley, and I kind of run what I just call the Arctic Ecology Program. So let me just start with my. This isn't just me. I've had lots of people helping. This is funded by the National Science Foundation. There's lots of students. This is just the people that I've worked with. The work I do is very collaborative. So I work with people from, particularly right now, Texas group, a Florida group, and a group in Anchorage. So this is just the Grand Valley group. So before I forget, there's lots of other people. I'm just going to do a quick background on why the Arctic really matters, some of the observed changes. You've probably seen some of this before. And then I'll talk about what ITEX is, and then ecosystem change, and then what we call the ITEX AON. So it's the International Tundra Experiment Arctic Observatory Network. That's kind of our current funding right now. So the red is really what I do. The blue is background, which is probably more interesting to you, to be honest. So the obvious backdrop is climate change. So the Arctic is experiencing climate change just like everywhere else. This just shows the range of climate change, for the next 100 years. So this scale is kind of consistent here. So we don't know how much climate change there'll be. It could be, it's unlikely to only be 1.5 degrees. It's probably closer to be, somewhere up in this range, but that's global. If we look at the Arctic generally is 3 times whatever the global was. It could be even more than that, but the Arctic warms more, and I'll go over why in a moment. But here's my research site, furthest point north in Alaska. So in simple terms, the reason why the Arctic warms so much more is there's 3 big positive feedbacks or reinforcing feedbacks. The simple one is snow reflects away the energy. So reflected by white snow or ice is 80 to 90% of all the energy coming in from the sun. And then if you change that to either soil or vegetation or water, it's effectively the inverse of that. So instead of 80 to 90% being lost, now you're going to absorb 80 to 90% of that, depending on where you are and angles and all that kind of stuff. As you warm, it's less white. As it's less white, it warms. As it's warmer, it's less white. I could do this for a long time. And that's why you see actually most of the warming is actually in the spring and in the fall, and to a lesser degree in the winter and the summer. So that's the main reason why the Arctic warms so much more. Along the same lines, plants are a really big part, and I'm a botanist, so I study the plants. So in simple terms, if you just, around here in Michigan, a typical winter, if you've plowed a field, it's white all winter. Now, we haven't had a typical winter in a while, so it warms and then melts and stuff. But if it was kind of a good winter, you would have white all winter. But if you didn't plow, then you'd have, plants sticking up. And those plants sticking up can absorb heat all winter. So if it's, you didn't plow down the corn husks or whatever, you'd have that sticking up. And if you go from tundra, which is, kind of really tiny plants, to, forest, then you've got these trees sticking up. And that's a huge feedback. So again, as the plants get taller, they don't have to go from grasses to trees. You can just have grasses that are bigger that stick up, and you can have shrubs that stick up more. So as those plants get taller, you absorb more heat. The more heat you absorb, the taller the plants get. Again, it's a big positive feedback. The next one is carbon. So this is just a picture of coastal erosion right near my site. And so you can see, it's kind of hard to tell with this, but the soils aren't really soils. I mean, it's almost pure organic matter. I mean, you could pretty much bag it up and sell it at Flowerland and is peat. So as you warm that, it breaks down more. I mean, the reason why this is all organic matter is because of slow decomposition, because the soils are really cold. And as you warm that, it metabolizes, breaks down, you release carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. It's either carbon dioxide or methane, depending on, you know, how wet it is. And then that contributes to global warming. And the more global warming, the warmer the soils, you get the idea. And this is big. I mean, this could be in the same order of magnitude as all fossil fuel burning. It's not a trivial amount. There's so much uncertainty on this, but because it's a big area, it's a potential really big source. So those are three big kind of global reasons why the Arctic really matters. I will just say as an aside, there's been a lot of media attention about tundra fires. Historically, we think of tundra as being, or at least in Alaska, in much of Siberia, the tundra is this wet area. It's all squishy. Well, and it's got all this organic matter because it's cold and it's wet, and that organic matter builds up. Well, as that gets hot and dry, that can catch fire. And when it does, it just burns until, I mean, it just keeps burning. And you can actually have the soils burn because it's so organic rich. So that's kind of an aside, and that's a huge potential release of carbon dioxide. If we look at this from a paleological perspective, this was a fun figure that came out last summer, a year ago summer, and it just shows over time, you know, the world, they just kind of made this dotted line, the world without polar caps, and then the world with polar caps. And they just kind of made this global temperature is around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, global average temperature. If you're below that, you've got ice at the poles, and above that you don't, because in the paleological history, there's lots of times where there wasn't sea ice, or not sea ice, but just ice in Greenland and ice in Antarctica. And so if we just kind of look at our recent warming, you know, that's our recent warming, to kind of put that in perspective. And then this is the amount of warming projected, and there's a bunch of uncertainty there. But the point is, we're flirting with a world without polar ice caps. The amount of warming that's projected, you know, in the next century is flirting with, from the paleological records, times that just didn't have polar ice caps, period. Now, that's not to say that Antarctica is going to melt in the next 100 years, because it's going to take a long time for that to happen. From a paleological perspective, that's the case. I'll also say, you know, if you're a geologist, you'd say, there's been climate change in the past, climate change now, no big deal, right? You know, this little bit that we're talking about is way less than like these huge changes that have happened in paleological scale. And that's true. But what a geologist would probably forget to mention is each one of these changes is associated with a really massive mass extinction. And as a biologist, you know, you kind of want to avoid those. So let me just zoom in here. So this little bit right here is what we're kind of like to compare ourselves with. And if I just zoom in on that, this is from a paper a few years ago that was really simplified, and I like it because of it. So this just shows the amount of warming. So that's the 3 degrees. That's kind of the middle of the road warming projections for the next, 50 years. And that puts us at this mid-Pliocene warm period about 3 million years ago. So if we go forward, we will be at that. And again, this is the middle of the road projections. It could be much more than that. So if we look at the Paleo Record, what the world looked like here, this is just an artist's picture of Greenland from that time. And it was very different. I mean, it was trees. There were trees in the northernmost Greenland. There were, megafaunas. I mean, think of the saber-toothed tigers and the woolly mammoths and then these camel creatures. The point being, the climate was very different. It wasn't just, a couple degrees warmer. The poles were as much as like 30 degrees warmer. And that's just hard to imagine. I mean, in order to have the trees and stuff, because we know what from the fossils, analogous critters, in order to have those creatures there, you had to have a certain climate. And that climate had to be much, much warmer. And it's just hard to wrap your mind around how that actually happened, because globally it wasn't that much warmer. The only way that they can make the models work is to have no sea ice in the Arctic during the winter. That's the only way they can make these work. So it would be like, around here, like Michigan, you don't get cold until unless the lakes freeze, because if you're right next to the lake shore, because you get that heat coming off of it. So that's presumably what happened paleo.
Bob, I have a question about soils, tundra soils. Were the soils a lot different? I mean, was there a soil in the Arctic areas in whatever 3 million years ago?
Yeah, it wasn't that much different than it is right now. It's not that long ago. If you do your geology stuff, you'd say, oh, wait a minute, what about plate tectonics? Greenland must have been at the equator. Nope. This is 50 million. We're talking 5, and we're really only talking 3. So barely measurable differences, feet, not miles, of where much of the Arctic was, certainly Greenland. So if we kind of, some of the things that have made the news, if you will, or some of the observed changes. So sea ice, the decline in sea ice. So here's the sea ice. The problem with the sea ice is it doesn't really capture it very well, because this is the 1984 sea ice. And the point here is there was lots of sea ice that was more than 4 years old. I mean, most of this is old ice, if you will. So if it's more than 4 years old, it's nice and thick, so you can walk on it, no problem. You could drive a truck on it. This was the 2016. So the extent is less, and that's the one that makes the newspaper, if you will. But that's almost irrelevant. There is no old ice left. That's kind of there's no old ice left. When I started in the 90s, I'd go to the talks. I'm a botanist, so it wasn't really my thing as sea ice, but it was always fun to go listen to these. And because Barrow, they do sea ice stuff from there, because it's kind of where they launch from, if you will. And they talk about 10-year-old ice. And well, there is no 10-year-old ice anymore. So right now we're poised, because there's none of that thick ice. Most of the ice that's remaining is just 1 or 2 year old ice. If you have a really warm year, you could lose it all. And the projections are that we will lose it all within the next 50 years, and probably quite a bit sooner than that. For the people in the villages, the Native Americans, the Inuit, it's a really big deal, because they're used to going out on the ice, and what's safe ice and what's not safe ice for whaling. So for them, they're very aware of these ice conditions. If we look on land, there's lots of stories that just show melting of Greenland, and to a different degree, Antarctica. So here's just a silly one. Which melts faster, thick ice or thin ice, right? So everyone say, well, of course, the thin one, but that's wrong. And I'll show you why. The places that actually have the most melting are these really deep areas here. So that red is how fast it's melting. And it's really melting fast, like some of the northern parts. And that doesn't make a lot of sense unless you look at kind of glacial dynamics. And again, I'm a botanist, so these are just kind of the highlights of stuff that I've seen. I'm part of the Arctic Observatory Network. So the funding is, does all this research. So we then go talk about, our own stuff. So your typical glacier here, you've got, moraines build up, right? And then if we change the water level, so, I mean, this is kind of, this is super protected here because, you get your glacier, it's below sea level here. I mean, you can get fjords or whatnot. But if we just change this water level a little bit, and so we're talking about now these deeper areas. So this really thick ice that made this really deep area, this has still got a moraine that protects it. And so historically you'd have, as this melts, you'd get this cold fresh water here, and that's quite a barrier. And this is protected and this melts very little. But as soon as this disappears, then you can get rapid melting because you've got this warm saltier, which is more dense, and that'll cut that away. And then these will break off and float away. In that scenario, once you get past this protective moraine, you can have massive melting until you get up out of the water here. And that can happen during the winter in the Arctic. I mean, that's crazy, but because it'd be super cold there, but the ocean is not frozen. Otherwise, I mean, it's the ocean. So it's got this layer at the top. So you could have a layer of ice here and then still have this warmer, saltier come in and melt this during the winter. So there's lots of examples where this is happening. So this is the one that's gotten the most media attention, if you will. So if you will, here's 50 years of melting. There's 60 years of melting. There's 40 years where it did nothing. It just was in a stasis. So that was the protected. And then there's 5 years of melting. 5 years of melting that was the equivalent of, 50 years before that, because of that really rapid that can happen. Again, you would think, well, as soon as you get out of the water, then that'll stop. The problem is you don't get out of the water. Greenland is mostly, all that ice and stuff is actually puts it below sea level. So that, you could have massive melting here, massive melting here, massive melting here. Antarctica is the same story. Most of Antarctica is actually below sea level. So once you get into that warming scenario where it's rapid melting, it's a runaway scenario. So this is like all the glaciers in the world other than Greenland and Antarctica. So it's just trivial. And then Greenland, and then Antarctica is where most of it is. So, we're talking about like 1 meter of sea level rise. Well, if you melt all Greenland, I mean, you're talking, 5-10 meters. And then this is what's considered vulnerable. You'd add another 10 meters or so. So, if we really are in that scenario where you melt all of this, I mean, we're talking lots of meters of sea level. That'll take thousands of years to happen. Last I heard was Greenland was on the projection to be, I think it was 1,000. This is silly, but I can't remember if it was 1,000 or 10,000 years, which is a really big difference. But the point is, it's after I'm dead. But it's in relative terms for society, it's not that long that this whole thing will be gone. This is just the 1 meter is visible from space. So if you then add more, then that's a bigger deal. On land, you guys had to talk about permafrost. So it's just a pretty picture of showing, the frozen ground. These are areas that are currently underlain by permafrost. Neat thing is a lot of the ocean is actually as well. That's actually archaic permafrost, because there's no way you can get permafrost under the ocean unless you had sea ice that was all the way touching the ground, or so that's a relic of the last ice age. 60 to 90% of this is vulnerable to not being permafrost anymore. So that's a big deal. And again, you guys had a whole talk on this. So, but the things that, you know, particularly people like around Fairbanks, because Fairbanks is right at that cutoff of where there's permafrost and not permafrost. You get these drunken forests where the soils, permafrost is like super duper hard. I've had to like dig to put probes through stuff, and it's easier to cut through like cement than it is to do permafrost. But then if you melt that or thaw it and it's wet, then it's just this soupy mud. So it's, you know, trees fall over, houses fall over, roads fall over. There's lots of examples of this, but many of these examples are not because of climate change, but because of stupid people building in stupid ways. Like if you had a heated basement, you're going to melt your permafrost, even if you're in the middle of, you know, Antarctica. But these are not stupid people building in stupid ways. These are examples from the permafrost becoming unstable. Kind of globally, there's a loss of lakes and ponds. It's the same idea. Permafrost is really hard and really hard to erode. So it's not uncommon that, you know, when I'm walking around at my sites, that you'll see a pond that's, you know, here, and then a pond that's, you know, right next to each other. Usually you don't have ponds that are really raised, you know, permanently, because the groundwater kind of, you know, evens stuff out, if you will. Well, permafrost is super hard to erode. You then thaw that and it erodes really fast. So you can just see from this picture all these little lakes, and they're just gone. This is showing from Alaska, but there's lots of, and this is old now, but there's lots of cases in Alaska and particularly Siberia, because those are the areas that have lots of these little lakes where they're just disappearing. And that's again because the permafrost is unstable, and then once you cut into it, then it erodes really fast. All right, so now we're to me. So what happens to the tundra? What happens to the plants, that kind of that unique tundra ecosystem? And if you just do, you know, a mountain, because it's easier to visualize, you've got the tundras at the top. And if you just kind of do your adiabatic lapse rate, so 1 degree Celsius, 100 meters, or if we do latitude, 1 degree Celsius, about 100 miles. So if we're talking 3 degrees warming, so that's driving south 300 miles. Now, it doesn't really work out evenly like that, but it is a good way to talk with your students about. I mean, just going an hour north, often around here, you probably can use a snowmobile. Whereas if you go an hour south, you probably can't use a snowmobile. You know, we're not talking an hour, we're talking, you know, 300 miles, you know, by the end of the century. So, you know, that's a good way to put it in perspective. So to look at tundra, there was this group of researchers that got together, and this was first started at KBS, so locally at MSU. So they got together and formed what was just called the International Tundra Experiment. And they agreed upon doing a little warming experiment and agreed upon different protocols so that you could then compare data across the Arctic. And these are all the different sites. And I'm one of those. And I started as a grad student so the ITEC's first meeting was 1990. I started in 95. So it was kind of, at the time, it was in full motion, you know, but now we look back and say, well, that was just the beginning of it. Right? And the group's been super successful. They did lots of synthesis. So they were one of the first ecology papers to do kind of a whole biome quantitative synthesis, because people were doing the same measurements. We kind of agreed to measure plants in the same way so you could compare across sites. So, and here's the web page. I'm now the co-chair of that group. Bottom line though, is super successful. So here's those sites again. And then these are where I'm working, these original ones. And it started out as MSU, but now it's Grand Valley. And then I also work with one of my friends from Texas, UTEP, University of Texas at El Paso. And then the other site that's the US site is at Toolik Lake. And again, that started out as Colorado, but now it's Florida International and University of Alaska at Anchorage. When you have these long-term data, there's kind of a passing this on. So I'm just going to focus on what I've actually done. So Upyavik, which was formerly Barrow, they changed names just a few years ago. And then Akasuk, which is just south of there. So I just show the temperature data for since I've been working there. So we've got temperature and precipitation and soil moisture, but the temperature is the more interesting one. If all I did was do the box here for the maximum and the minimum for Barrow, and you see that Barrow is now in the climate space, if you will, of Akasuk. The last few years in Barrow have been as warm as what Akasuk used to be, just 20 years ago. So we expect the plants to change. Akasuk's getting warmer too. Precipitation's all over the place. Precipitation's kind of irrelevant. Soil moisture is more of an issue. This is precipitation just during the summer, I should say. And the wetness has more to do with how much snow came during the winter and how much it, accumulates. But that's been kind of all over the place, whereas temperature has been a more constant increase. So we look at the plants, and historically we used these chambers as a forecasting what the future would be. So a kind of a window to the future. So we've been putting these chambers out for almost 30 years. The growing season is really short, so it works great for student projects. Snow melt happens like early June. Refreezes kind of mid-September, but the plants are really done by mid-August. So we can go up in June and leave at the end of August and really have seen that whole season. And so we measure all kinds of stuff. But so I just got, this is simple stuff that, high school students could do. So we just measure like when the first green leaves are, when the inflorescence starts to elongate, the first flowers, when flowers are done, when they turn brown. Luckily for us, this all happens really short. We also do some simple stuff like just measure how long the leaves are, how tall the plants are, count the number of flowers. So here's just a little bit of kind of fun data. We're just counting flowers. So this is great. You just go out with a counter and you hire a bunch of undergrads and they just go count flowers on blots. And this is cassiope. It's got these cute little bell-shaped flowers. And so I cheated and showed like a crappy control plot and a happy, full of flower warmed plot, just to kind of make the point that, you warm them up and they actually flower more. And so here's actual data. We've been doing this for a long time, so it's kind of a mess. But if you just kind of look, first off, that's a lot of flowers. So 500 flowers in 1 meter is 1 meter square is a lot of flowers. But that only happens in a few of these years. And so these open circles are our warmed plots, and then the squares are the not warmed. So an easy generalization is when you have warming, you get more flowers in there earlier. Very intuitive, but it's nice to actually have real data that shows that. But there's huge variability between years, much more variability between years than there is with that little bit of warming. I should say that the chamber is warm 1 to 3 degrees, depending on what year it is. And that has more to do with just how sunny it has been. Another really simple measurement is just how tall the carex is. So we literally just take a ruler and measure how tall this is. And so that's the inflorescence length. So, the top of the stalk, if you will. And Carex aquatus is actually a species around here. And so here's just graphed out. Each one of these points is a year at one of our sites. And then, and it's just the length here. and I've graphed that against heat sums. So heat sums are we call them thawing degree days, but all it is the average temperature added each day. So it's a way to see how warm that area was that year. They're used we call them growing degree days around here, and they use a different base. Most of your plants around here don't start growing until about 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So like right now, my grass is really green, but it's not really growing because it's been in the 40s. If we start being above 50, then I'll probably have to mow again. In the Arctic, it's 0. So, over here would be warmer years and over here would be colder years. But then I did, these are actually 2 locations. So this is Upyavik or Barrow and then Akasuk. And then the open are the warmed plots. Point here is the warmed plots kind of give us a more variability to look at. And you can see that there's a really strong relationship here, that as you get warmer, these plants get taller. We're going to actually clean this data up and make it a data set that high school kids could download and do their own calculations with. That's on my to-do list in the near future. And that's one of the strongest relationships in biological systems that you can get. These ones are actually a different site. So I could make this even a stronger one by just having 2 different locations. But if we look at just what plants are there, so we do point framing. So we just look and, say what plants below the point. And so you'd look at each plant. This is just your cover. And I just super simplified these into shrubs, evergreen shrubs, deciduous shrubs, forbs, grass-like, and then mosses, bryophytes, and lichens. And then there's a lot of standing dead in the Arctic, and then a bunch of litter. So you can see when we sampled, so we didn't sample every year, you can see the different, I just put the years that were actually sampled. And you can see that there's been a trend. If we throw on our warmed plots, it's even more extreme, if you will. So the graminoids have really increased, the blue here, and then the evergreen shrubs have really increased. That's true over time, and it's true with warming. So that suggests that it's the temperature that's really the driver here. I also point out that we're reaching the point that you're about 100% cover. This is tundra, so there's oftentimes a bunch of bare ground and stuff. A lot of other studies have shown that bryophytes and lichens don't do so well with warming, with climate change. And that's probably going to happen at this site as well. But it hasn't really happened yet because we've just recently got to the 100% cover, if you will. The bryophytes and lichens do worse because they get shaded out. So they're just getting to the point where they get shaded out. If we compare our work with then all these other sites, that's kind of the power of the iText network, is that you can then compare across all these other sites. So this is a paper that did that. And this was because these sites have been going on for a long time now. This was just the control plots. And there's funny stats here, but in simple terms, this is just the height, the change in height over time. And you can see that plants, basically all these plants get taller. So shrubs get taller. If it's not overlapping 0, then it shows it's getting taller. So you could break these into different groups, but graminoids are getting taller, grasses, your forbs are getting taller. The thicker line is not technically overlapping 0, so it's statistically significant. So plants are getting taller, which again is intuitive. Then we've also got winners and losers. So I just put here, litter's increased, evergreen shrubs have increased, tall shrubs and low shrubs have increased. Dwarf shrubs don't. Many of the shrubs at our sites just hug the ground, so they don't win because other stuff overtops them. If we just talk carbon, so carbon dynamics, we talk about doing flux measures. So we're measuring carbon dioxide exchange in here. So we just put this glass thing over and measured the exchange. And so that's a measure of photosynthesis, but it's also a measure of respiration because there's also respiration happening there. And you literally just put a black tarp over this and then do it again to get a measure of respiration. And you do that a bunch of times. And here's what the data looks like. So you've got gross primary production, the GPP, and then ecosystem respiration is the ER, because again, you'd measure those separate. But what we really care about is the net ecosystem exchange. And you see that the orange here is on the same side as the photosynthesis. So we're a carbon sink is kind of the point there. When you just warm those plots, again, just a little bit of warming, they become a carbon source. So it's the same side as the respiration. So that little bit of warming increases respiration more than it increases photosynthesis. So that's that. So with just a little bit of warming, it switches from a carbon sink to a carbon source. And that seems to be happening in the control plots now as well. And
can you say why respiration would be favored over photosynthesis?
Because there's so much organic matter in the soils that little bit of warming is more than I mean, the plants do better. I mean, I showed a bunch of stuff showing the plants do better, but that having a thicker active layer, thicker soils, and having the just warmer releases more carbon.
This is Deirdre. I'm sorry. Is there also at some point, is there like a tipping point? I know you spoke about the shading and the lichens not or their inability to increase. I did a similar research project where we had control systems where we pumped in CO2, but what we found out over time is that there would always be there was an increase in the plant growth and things like that, but at some point there's a tipping point. So if in the case where the shading that you're speaking about, I'm just wondering that after these plants grow so tall, maybe that is where the tipping point is taking place and is sort of blocking out the temperature or the heat.
So it can get complicated really fast. Mosses tend to be a good insulator for the for the temperature. So as you kind of as you add more plants, vascular plants, shrubs and grasses,
Mm-hmm.
then what you can have is a thinner moss layer, and then that moss layer then doesn't insulate as much, so it can get warmer soils. Plants do better, but they don't as you warm, but there's diminishing returns, if you will, at least at the shorter time scales. Presumably, if you then fast forward, in 100 years, then you'd have trees moving or whatever. But plants there, they just can't do that much more photosynthesis. So that's why you get this change in the balance. But if you look at they actually looked at the isotopes of the carbon being released, because there's lots of nuclear testing. And so you can actually look at the isotopes of the carbon dioxide being released, and you can show if it's happened in the last 50 years before nuclear testing or after nuclear testing. So before 50 years or after, in the most recent. And there's lots of studies that show that a lot of this release is actually the recent stuff. And then there's other studies that show, well, most of it's going to be the recent stuff, but there are studies that show clearly that some of that, and a significant portion of that, is actually some of the old carbon. So it's and that seems to be a pretty global phenomenon, that the tundras in general are switching from a sink to a source. There's certainly places that are still a sink, but that's kind of an on average. And there's a lot of people working on that. And we're one of them. To be honest, that's one of our, that's not our main focus, but certainly it's one of the things we do look at. We've been trying to scale up. So, we do a lot of measures, just like literally counting flowers. We've started to do a lot of just image processing, and you can do that image processing from just a close-up camera. Drones have become cheap recently. So 2019 was our first year where we really did drones, thoroughly. And then there's always imagery that can be satellite imagery, or it could be airborne. Really, there's not much difference between the two, just depending on, the resolution and so forth. So that's now the ITEX AON, which is our current funding, because it's impossible to get funded to do the same thing over and over and over unless you say that it's new and exciting. So the way we've kind of done it is this ITEX, which is this old long-term stuff, and then the Arctic Observatory Network is funding, and recently it's now navigating the new Arctic, is the even newer funding. They're all intertwined, and so we're doing the sites at Barrow, at Akasuk, and then Toolik and Nunavut. And Nunavut's right next to Toolik, so it's just kind of a 5-minute drive. But it's different elevation, so it's climatically a little different. So we're kind of comparing against those 4. And so at each of these sites, we're also trying to get, beyond just a single plots. So we've got these cool, it's just this little trolley that just moves along, and measures stuff as it goes along. So you can see the poles here. So it's just on these cables, and it just makes measurements every second, depending on what the measurement is. So then we can kind of try to get across the landscape in these more automated measurements. We also just walk around and do the same kind of measurements, kind of, because the trolley can only do, that 50-meter area. So then we go and do this kind of across the landscape. Ultimately, we'd like to do some nice vegetation maps. This is just showing elevation. So this is taking a satellite image, kind of a lower resolution. You see it's not very good. And then this is LiDAR. LiDAR is like the super high resolution stuff where it uses light, and it's really expensive, and it's super high resolution. It's like the best you can get. Well, we've shown that using we were using kites. Now we're using drones. You can get pretty much the same resolution as a LiDAR for a fraction of the cost. And then the idea is then to map the vegetation. We haven't done that yet. So here's just kind of a picture of one of the sites. So we've got these long-term warming experiments. You're seeing the boardwalk. There's some students there making measurements. This is that tram. So that 50 meters, we call it our mobile instrumented sensor platform, but it's a little trolley that makes measurements. And I didn't really point out, but there's these grid points all throughout. And then that grid is like, it's a kilometer square. So that kind of gets us off the, one little site, and it gets all these in between areas. And I look at the landscape. I didn't point out, but we also put up Pheno Cams, which are just like your bird cams. But they take they take pictures from the same location year after year after year, and you can see the change through the season and the change between years. And you can actually use that to kind of estimate, when the seasons occur and how much biomass there is and stuff. And then drones are recent to kind of get in between everything. And we do lots of little side experiments as well. So that's effectively our ITEX AON network, which kind of the goal is to document and understand ecosystem change across the northern Alaska. And so here's just a last fun thing. So this is from the drone, and you can see we eat lunch and stuff in the little tent. There's the solar panels there, and you can see that tram. That's the tram. We've got a little boardwalk, and then kind of an old-fashioned boardwalk. There's our little chambers. We've got another site over there as well. There'd be poles all over the place here that we walk. You can see some students doing stuff here. It's our little climate station. This is actually at Akasuk. And you can see also that it's really wet, you know, all these little lakes, ponds and lakes. So here's kind of a quick summary. There's lots of changes occurring. The Arctic in general is less white. There's more plants. The plants are getting taller. Shrubs are increasing. Carbon's being released. I actually manage 3 different websites. So this is just my little research group. This is the group that I work with, the ITEX network. And then this is the collaborative research for the different institutions, Grand Valley, Texas, Florida, and Alaska.